What happens when one of Britain's most beloved comedic actors finds himself in the hot seat across from a host who seems determined to pick a fight? When Rowan Atkinson, the man behind Mr. Bean and Blackadder, agreed to appear on The View, nobody expected what was about to unfold. This wasn't just another celebrity interview. This was a masterclass in how a conversation can spiral completely out of control. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments what you think about heated television moments like this one. The studio lights were blazing as Rowan Atkinson settled into his chair on The View's iconic set. Known for his measured, thoughtful approach to interviews, Atkinson had come prepared to discuss his latest projects and perhaps share some insights about his decades-long career in comedy. What he hadn't prepared for was the combative energy that would soon fill the room. Joy Behar, seated directly across from him, had that familiar glint in her eye that regular viewers of The View knew all too well. It was the look she got when she sensed an opportunity to stir the pot, to push buttons, to create the kind of television moment that have people talking for days. So, Rowan, Joy began, her voice carrying that distinctive New York edge. You've made a career out of playing characters who don't speak much. Mr. Bean barely says a word, and even in Blackadder, you're often the straight man. Is it because you don't actually have much to say in real life? The question hung in the air like a challenge. The other hosts exchanged glances, sensing immediately that this wasn't going to be the typical light-hearted celebrity chat they'd been expecting. Atkinson, ever the professional, maintained his composure, though there was a slight tightening around his eyes. Well, Joy, Atkinson replied, his crisp British accent cutting through the studio's tension. I'd say there's a significant difference between choosing when to speak and having nothing to say. Comedy, particularly physical comedy, often communicates more in a single gesture than pages of dialogue ever could. Joy leaned forward, clearly not satisfied with what she perceived as a deflection. But isn't that just a fancy way of saying you're hiding behind characters because you're uncomfortable with who you really are? I mean, when was the last time we saw the real Rowan Atkinson, not some bumbling character or uptight historical figure? The studio audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the warm, welcoming atmosphere that guests typically encountered on daytime television. Whoopi Goldberg, sitting at the head of the table, shot Joy a warning look, but it went unnoticed. Atkinson's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I find it interesting that you equate choosing one's words carefully with hiding joy. In my experience, those who speak the loudest often have the least to say. My characters aren't masks, they're explorations of the human condition. Mr. Bean, for instance, represents the universal experience of navigating a world that doesn't always make sense. Oh, please, Joy interrupted, waving her hand dismissively. That's just pretentious nonsense. You made millions playing a guy who acts like a child because it's easier than dealing with real adult conversations. At least here in America, our comedians aren't afraid to tackle real issues, to say what needs to be said. The comment hit its mark. Atkinson's polite smile faltered for just a moment, revealing a flash of genuine irritation. I wasn't aware that geography determined the validity of one's artistic expression, Joy, though. I suppose reducing complex creative choices to nationalist talking points is easier than engaging with the actual work. Joy's eyes lit up. She'd found her way to make this interview memorable. Nationalist talking points. That's rich coming from someone who's made a career out of perpetuating the stereotype of the bumbling British fool. Tell me, Rowan, how does it feel to know that your most famous character is basically a grown man with the mental capacity of a toddler? What kind of message does that send to kids? The other hosts were now visibly uncomfortable. Sarah Haynes tried to interject with a lighter question about Atkinson's upcoming projects, but Joy bulldozed right over her. I mean, seriously, Joy continued, her voice rising slightly. When parents put on Mr. Bean for their kids, they're basically saying it's okay to go through life being incompetent and irresponsible. Is that really the legacy you want to leave? Atkinson's hands, which had been resting calmly on the armrest of his chair, slowly clenched into fists. His voice, when he spoke, was measured but carried an undertone of steel that hadn't been there before. Joy, I'm beginning to suspect that you've never actually watched any of my work with any degree of attention. Mr. Bean's appeal lies not in incompetence, but in his unique problem-solving approach and his resilience in the face of everyday challenges. Children connect with him because he sees the world differently, not because he's incapable problem-solving. Joy laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. The guy can't figure out how to put on pants without causing a catastrophe. And don't even get me started on Blackadder, where you play characters who are either completely cynical or utterly powerless. What is it with British humor and this obsession with failure and misery? The studio had gone deadly quiet. Even the camera operators seemed to sense that something was going very wrong. Atkinson's professional facade was beginning to crack, and viewers could see the real man underneath. The artist who had spent decades perfecting his craft, only to have it dismissed and mischaracterized by someone who clearly hadn't done her homework. I think, Atkinson said slowly, his words carefully chosen, that you're confusing sophistication with misery. Joy, British humor has always dealt with the complexities of life. The moments where things don't go according to plan. It's about finding grace and humor in those moments, not wallowing in them. Joy wasn't backing down. If anything, she was doubling down, sensing that she had Atkinson on the defensive. Grace. There's nothing graceful about a grown man destroying a department store because he can't figure out how to try on a shirt. And as for Blackadder, those characters are just mean-spirited and cruel. How is that supposed to be funny? The question revealed everything. Joy hadn't just misunderstood Atkinson's work. She had fundamentally missed the point of it entirely, and now she was attacking not just his characters, but the very foundation of his artistic philosophy. Atkinson leaned back in his chair, and for a moment his expression was unreadable. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of decades of experience and expertise. Joy, I'm starting to realize that this conversation was never intended to be about my work or my career. You've clearly made up your mind about what my characters represent, despite having apparently never understood them. But let me ask you this. When was the last time you created something that brought joy to millions of people around the world? The question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Joy's face flushed red, and for the first time in the interview, she seemed momentarily speechless. But that moment didn't last long. Excuse me. Joy's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. Are you seriously questioning my credentials? I've been in this business for decades. I've written books. I've done stand-up. I've been on television longer than some of your fans have been alive. Atkinson's eyebrows raised slightly, a gesture that those familiar with his work would recognize as the precursor to a devastating verbal blow. I wasn't questioning your longevity, Joy. I was asking about creation, about bringing something new and joyful into the world. There's a difference between occupying space in the entertainment industry and actually contributing to it. The other hosts were now exchanging increasingly worried glances. Whoopi tried once again to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Maybe we should talk about your upcoming projects, Rowan. I understand you're working on something new. But Joy wasn't about to let this go. Her ego had been bruised and she was in full attack mode now. Oh, I see what this is about. This is that typical British arrogance, isn't it? You think you're so much better than American television. So much more sophisticated. Well, let me tell you something, Mr. Bean. Your highbrow act doesn't work on me, Mr. Bean, Atkinson repeated slowly. And there was something in his tone that made everyone in the studio sit up a little straighter. You keep coming back to that character as if it's some kind of insult. Do you realize that Mr. Bean has brought laughter to children and adults in over 200 countries? That character has transcended language barriers and cultural differences in a way that very few pieces of entertainment ever achieve. Joy scoffed. Oh, please. Transcended language barriers. He doesn't talk. A mime could do the same thing, could they? Atkinson's voice was getting sharper now, his professional politeness finally beginning to fray. Because if it were that simple, Joy, why aren't there hundreds of internationally beloved mime characters? Physical comedy isn't just about not speaking. It's about understanding human nature so completely that you can communicate universal truths without words. Universal truths. Joy was practically sneering now. What universal truth is there in watching a man struggle to figure out how a revolving door works? What's the deep meaning behind getting your head stuck in a turkey? The reference was to one of Mr. Bean's most famous sketches, but the way Joy delivered it made it sound crude and pointless. Several audience members actually gasped at her tone. Atkinson's face had gone very still. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but everyone in the studio could hear him perfectly. The universal truth, Joy, is that we all struggle with things that seem simple to others. We all have moments where the world feels foreign and confusing. Miss Bean resonates with people because he faces those moments with curiosity instead of cynicism, with persistence instead of giving up. He finds wonder in the ordinary and refuses to be defeated by life's small absurdities. That's just Joy started, but Atkinson wasn't finished. And the fact that you can reduce that to a man with his head stuck in a turkey tells me everything I need to know about your capacity for understanding nuance. You see the surface and assume that's all there is. It's the intellectual equivalent of judging a book by its cover and then criticizing the author for your own inability to read. The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Joy's mouth had dropped open slightly. She wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not on her own show. How dare you, she said, her voice shaking slightly with rage. How dare you sit here and insult my intelligence? I've interviewed presidents. I've covered major news stories. You've done many things, Atkinson interrupted, and his interruption was so smooth and confident that it stopped Joy mid-sentence. But I have to ask, in all of those interviews, in all of those news stories, did you approach them with the same level of preparation you brought to this conversation? Because if this is representative of your journalistic standards, I'm beginning to understand why American television has the reputation it does abroad. Joy's face was now bright red. What is that supposed to mean? What reputation? Atkinson smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had just been handed the perfect opening. Well, Joy, there's a perception internationally that American daytime television prioritizes conflict over content, noise over nuance. That it's more interested in creating viral moments than actually informing or entertaining its audience. I always assumed that was an unfair stereotype, but sitting here today, I'm starting to think it might be more accurate than I'd hoped. You pretentious arrogant. Joy started to rise from her chair, but Whoopi's hand on her arm stopped her. Joy, Whoopi said firmly, maybe we should take a breath here. But Joy shook her off. No, I'm not going to sit here and let this pompous British snob insult me in my show in my country on national television. Atkinson leaned back in his chair, completely calm despite the storm he'd unleashed. I haven't insulted your country, Joy. I've made observations about a particular approach to television production, and I've pointed out that your criticism of my work seems to stem from a fundamental misunderstanding of what that work actually is. If you find those observations insulting, perhaps the problem isn't with the observations. The problem, Joy said, her voice rising to a near shout, is that you think you're better than everyone else. You think your British sophistication makes you superior to us crude Americans. Actually, Atkinson said, and his voice was maddeningly calm, I think good comedy is good comedy regardless of where it comes from. I think thoughtful entertainment can come from anywhere, but I also think that criticism should be informed and interviews should be conducted with at least a basic understanding of the subject matter. These aren't particularly British expectations. Joy, they're professional ones. The other hosts were looking anywhere but at the confrontation unfolding in front of them. The audience was completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something that was spiraling far beyond normal television boundaries. Joy stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward. I don't have to sit here and listen to this. This is my show and I won't be talked down to by some has-been comedian who peaked 20 years ago with a character who can't even speak. Atkinson's composure finally cracked. Not into anger, but into something worse. A cold disappointment that was some more devastating than any shout could have been. Has been, he said quietly, rising slowly from his own chair. Joy! Bean's Christmas special aired last month and broke viewing records across 3 continents. My live performances sell out within minutes of tickets going on sale. But even if none of that were true, even if I were exactly the has-been you seem so desperate for me to be, it wouldn't change the fact that you've spent the last 15 minutes demonstrating a complete inability to engage with ideas that challenge your preconceptions. He paused, looking directly at Joy with an expression of profound disappointment. I came here expecting a conversation. What I found was a performance and not a very good one. The words hit Joy like a physical blow. Her face cycled through several shades of red before settling on a dangerous crimson. The other hosts were frozen, unsure whether to intervene or simply let this train wreck continue to its inevitable conclusion. A performance. Joy's voice was trembling with rage. You want to see a performance? I'll give you a performance. You sit there with your fancy accent and your pompous attitude, acting like you're some kind of artistic genius, but you know what you really are. You're a one-trick pony who got lucky with a character so simple that even children can understand it. And the reason children can understand it is because it has the intellectual depth of a puddle. Atkinson stood completely still for a moment, absorbing the full weight of Joy's attack. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet that the studio microphones had to strain to pick it up. Joy, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say because I'm only going to say it once. He took a step closer to the panel, his presence somehow commanding despite his calm demeanor. You have just spent the better part of 20 minutes demonstrating exactly why intelligent discourse is dying in American media. You came into this interview with your mind made up, your talking points prepared, and your agenda set. You had no interest in learning anything about my work, my process, or my perspective. You wanted a target and you thought I would be an easy one. Joy opened her mouth to interrupt, but Atkinson held up a hand and something in his gesture was so authoritative that she actually stopped. But here's what you failed to understand. He continued, his voice growing stronger. The reason Mr. Bean has endured for over 3 decades isn't because he's simple. It's because he's honest. He approaches the world with genuine curiosity, with hope, with a willingness to try again when things go wrong. He doesn't assume the worst about people or situations. He doesn't attack what he doesn't understand. In that sense, Joy, he's the opposite of everything you've demonstrated here today. The studio was so quiet that the sound of Joy's breathing was audible. Her face had gone from red to pale, and for the first time in the interview, she seemed to realize that she might have pushed too far. Now wait just a minute, she started. But Atkinson wasn't finished. No, Joy, you've had your minutes, several of them in fact, and you've used everyone to prove my point about the difference between speaking and having something to say. You see, the tragedy here isn't that you disagree with my work. People are entitled to their opinions, even poorly informed ones. The tragedy is that you had an opportunity to have a real conversation with someone whose perspective might have broadened your understanding, and instead you chose to turn it into a gladiatorial combat for the entertainment of your audience. Whoopi finally found her voice. Rowan, I think maybe we all got a little heated here. Why don't we? No, Whoopi, Atkinson said, turning to look at her with genuine regret. This isn't about getting heated. This is about professional standards and basic respect. Joy didn't get heated. She got personal. She attacked not just my work, but the intelligence of everyone who enjoys it. She reduced decades of creative effort to crude stereotypes and then had the audacity to suggest that her ignorance somehow represented a higher standard of discourse. He turned back to Joy, who is now looking distinctly uncomfortable under his steady gaze. You called me a has-been, Joy. You said I peaked 20 years ago. But let me ask you something. When was the last time you created something that brought people together instead of driving them apart? When was the last time your work made someone smile instead of making them angry? When was the last time you used your platform to build something up instead of tearing something down? Joy's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The woman, who never seemed to be at a loss for something to say, had been rendered speechless. You know what the real difference is between American and British comedy? Atkinson continued, his voice gaining momentum. It's not sophistication or intelligence or any of the cultural stereotypes you seem so fond of. The difference is that British comedy often punches up at authority and power, while American comedy increasingly punches down at anyone who dares to be different, vulnerable, or sincere. Today, Joy, you've demonstrated that principle perfectly. Sarah Haynes made a desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Maybe we could talk about your charity work, Rowan. I know you're involved with several, but Atkinson was already moving toward his chair to collect his jacket. I appreciate the attempt, Sarah, but I think we're well past the point where this conversation can be rescued. Joy has made it very clear that she's not interested in actual dialogue, and I'm not interested in providing content for her circus. Joy finally found her voice again, and predictably it was defensive and angry. You can't just walk out. This is live television. You have a commitment. Atkinson paused in putting on his jacket and looked at her with something approaching pity. Joy, my commitment was to participate in an interview, not to serve as a punching bag for your insecurities. There's a difference between challenging questions and personal attacks, between professional skepticism and willful ignorance. You crossed that line 15 minutes ago and you've been dancing on the other side ever since. This is ridiculous. Joy snapped, her composure completely gone now. You're acting like a child who didn't get his way. This is how interviews work in the real world. We ask tough questions. Atkinson finished putting on his jacket and turned to face Joy one final time. No, Joy. In the real world, interviewers prepare. They research their subjects. They ask informed questions based on actual knowledge rather than assumptions and prejudices. What you've done here today isn't journalism. It's not entertainment. And it's certainly not professional. It's simply sad. He looked around the panel, his expression softening slightly as he addressed the other hosts. Whoopee. Sarah, I apologize that you had to witness this. You've tried admirably to maintain some semblance of civility, but unfortunately, one person's determination to create conflict has poisoned the entire conversation. Joy stood up abruptly, her chair rolling backward again. Don't you dare apologize for me. I don't need your pity or your condescension. If you can't handle a tough interview, maybe you should stick to children's television. The insult was clearly meant to be a final blow, but it had the opposite effect. Atkinson smiled, and for the first time since the interview began, it was a genuine smile. You know what, Joy? You've just given me the perfect ending to this debacle. Yes, I do work in children's television sometimes. Do you know why? Because children appreciate honesty, creativity, and genuine emotion. They don't have time for the kind of manufactured outrage and artificial conflict that you seem to think passes for adult conversation. Children understand that entertainment should bring joy, not just generate clicks and controversy. He moved toward the edge of the set, then paused and looked back at Joy one more time. Perhaps if more adults approached the world with the openness and honesty of children, we wouldn't need characters like Mr. Bean to remind us what genuine curiosity and resilience look like. Joy was practically vibrating with rage. Now fine, walk away. Run back to England where people will appreciate your precious Mr. Bean. We don't need you here. Atkinson's final smile was devastating in its kindness. Joy. The beautiful thing about good comedy, good art, good entertainment of any kind is that it doesn't matter whether you need it or not. It exists for anyone who's willing to approach it with an open mind and a generous spirit. Unfortunately, you've demonstrated today that those qualities are in rather short supply at this particular table. With that, Rowan Atkinson walked off the set of The View, leaving behind a stunned studio audience, a panel of bewildered hosts, and one very red-faced Joy Behar, who had just learned what happens when preparation meets pomposity, when genuine talent meets manufactured outrage, and when class meets chaos on live television. The cameras continued rolling as Joy tried desperately to regain control of her show, but the damage was done. In less than 30 minutes, she had managed to turn what should have been a delightful interview with one of the world's most beloved entertainers into a masterclass in how not to conduct yourself as a professional interviewer. And that's the story of how Rowan Atkinson walked off The View, leaving Joy Behar to face the consequences of her own unprofessionalism. What do you think? Was Atkinson right to leave, or should he have stayed and continued the fight? Let me know in the comments below.